Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. We are in week 1 of Sagalong, and I hope you're having fun. We're reading Egil's Saga. We're about a quarter of the way through it, and I know that I have my bear shirt on, but I'm going to try not to go berserk as we talk about the events that transpired across these 22 chapters, the characters we met. And I think there's a key theme in this first portion of Egil's Saga, and it's a wonderful counterpoint to a key theme from Njal's Saga, which we read in 2021 for Sagalong. And it's the danger of a central authority, the danger of unchecked authority that we see in King Harald's unification of Norway, the violence that exists. And that, I think, acts as a fascinating counterpoint to Njal's Saga, where we very much saw the dangers of no central authority, the dangers of these anarchic perpetual blood feuds when there's no authority to sort of put an end to them and stop them. And so that was certainly on my mind as I was reading. But it was also fascinating to see an archetypal sort of tragedy occur across these first 22 chapters. If we excise these chapters from Egil's Saga, they would form their own really fascinating short story or tragedy about, the dangers of a king's authority, the dangers of a monarchy, the dangers of evil and false counselors, a tradition that spans many genres and many centuries of world literature. But I always enjoy the Icelandic sagas. They're an interesting branch of world literature. They're an interesting branch of the tradition of the novel, a branch that isn't necessarily in the shadow of the tradition of the novel. And so things happen in a different order. And one of the things that I appreciate about reading the sagas is seeing what makes them unique and distinct as sort of this other form the novel could have taken. That was part of our sort of discussion. Lukáš at A Cruel Reader's Thesis had noted that as well. And allowing that contrast to magnify certain aspects of what we enjoy in the tradition of the novel compared to an Icelandic saga. But ultimately, we have a dynamite ending in chapter 22 to this sort of arc within Egil's Saga. And it should be noted that we have yet to meet him. He's the titular character of the saga is not a character in the saga yet. He hasn't even been born. We're in Tristram Shandy territory. Instead, we get, there was a man named Ulf, and we get Ulf's ancestors. That whole there was a man named is a refrain that occurs throughout this saga and many other sagas. It seems like a quick sort of transition to stitch in, okay, new characters, scene change, let's keep moving, different stream of the narrative. And that's really quite, quick. It's a quick transition across the saga. But we learn about Ulf. People say that he was a very able farm manager. He always rose early to see to the work of his laborers and skilled craftsmen and have a look at his cattle and cornfields. From time to time, he would talk to people who needed his counsel, for he was a shrewd man and always gave good advice on all problems. But every day, as it drew towards evening, he would grow so ill-tempered that no one could speak to him, and he always went to bed early. There was talk about his being a shape changer, and people called him Kvedulf, or Night Wolf. That's fascinating, and yet we don't really hear too much more about it. The fact, though, that it's there in the first chapter is notable, and it's going to be important as we, pursue Egil's Saga across the next 3 weeks. Kvedulf and his wife had 2 sons. The elder was named Thorolf, and the younger, Grim. They both grew up to be big, strong men, just like their father. Thorolf was very handsome and a man of great promise. He took after his mother's side of the family. What a nice guy. He was cheerful and generous, zealous in everything he did, and very ambitious. Everybody liked him. Grim was a dark, ugly man, the image of his father in looks and temper. He became a very good manager. What a wonderful contrast between these two brothers. He was a skilled blacksmith and carpenter, and grew to be a great craftsman. In winter, he used to sail on fishing trips along with several of his household servants to net herring. And so we learn that the sons are in their prime. And then we gradually start to find out what's going on in Norway. And we have a king who has decided that his authority needs to expand. He's going to unify Norway, various petty kingdoms, villages, small fortresses. He's going to conquer all of them and bring them under his authority. And historically, this did occur. What we see now is we've met Kvedulf and his 2 sons, Thorolf and Grim, and they're drawn into this nexus, this sense of, join me and I send us, join me or send one of your sons to serve because you're, sort of with me or against me. And we start to see this growing threat. And as in the Icelandic sagas, anytime that there's a character who has sort of a bad premonition, that's going to come true. It's a bit like those, as I mentioned, those Greek tragedies, those works where somebody who is a seer or a prophet is a seer or a prophet. If a ship's going to sink and somebody's worried about it, it's going to sink. If somebody shouldn't go, to some event, they shouldn't go there. So we get a sense very quickly that the violence King Harald is wreaking on sort of these people he wants to extend his authority over is going to be a violence that he will now turn inward at some point. And Thorolf is warned by his father, don't get involved. I'm not getting involved. Grim's not getting involved. You shouldn't get involved either. But Thorolf goes and joins and turns out to be a great captain, a very skilled warrior, a skilled leader. People like him. He's successful. But there's these sort of distant half-relatives who he just decides don't need to be receiving any inheritance in maintaining consistency with those two young men, their half-brother, essentially disinheriting them. Thorolf just maintains that, and they start to conspire against him. They whisper about his incompetence. We have, little Dukes of Gloucester walking around, whispering in the king's ears all the evil counsels that they have about Thorolf and how he's greedy and a traitor and nobody likes him. People like him too much. They'd be willing to rise up under him and threaten this king. And of course, a king who has been unifying his kingdom through violence must be wary of somebody turning that violence against him. And so he begins to listen to these counselors. And for a long time, it seems that there aren't really any great action set pieces. What we have is this tragic court drama where we can see the conspiracies, we see the lies. There's talk of battles and action, but there's not a lot of description. And then right towards the end of this section, Thorolf seized the ship and all its cargo and put Thorir ashore on the island. Then he sailed north along the coast with both ships. When they reached the Gudalav, they dropped anchor and lay there until nightfall. As soon as it was dark, they rowed the longship up the river and made for the farm owned by Halvaro and Sigtryg. They arrived before daybreak and surrounded the house and shouted their war cry. The men inside woke up at that and rushed for their weapons. Thorgir fled from the sleeping hall. There was a high stockade around the farmhouse. Thorgir ran at it and gripped the top of one of the posts and vaulted it. Thorgil's Gjalandi was standing nearby. He swung his sword at Thorgir and severed the hand which had gripped the post. Thorgir ran off into the woods, but his brother Thorir and more than 20 others were killed there. So now the action's heating up. And that occurs across the sagas. We were introduced to these characters. There was a man named. And we get these little, people who flit in and out of the sagas. We don't always learn even what happened to them. They're just, or where they came from. They just show up. They are part of the action. They're part of the narrative. And then sometimes they just disappear. Other times we find out that they have a hand cut off or that their brother is killed. But that action starts to heat up. And finally, Sigtryg and Halvard, who have stolen from Thorolf, he's stolen back from them. They get approval to go kill him. Finally, King Harald is going to order the death of one of his key retainers, a man who's sort of been holding the border. It's a little bit as if instead of Macbeth assassinating Duncan were to send some people to go assassinate Macbeth. We have almost that type of power dynamic between them. And so as that's going on, the king decides that he's just going to go take care of it himself. And so they go up. The king had the house surrounded. Then his men shouted their war cry, and the signal for attack was blown on the king's trumpet. When Thorolf and his men heard this, they ran for their weapons, for every man had a full set of arms hanging over his place. The king ordered someone to shout that women, children, old people, slaves, and bondsmen were to leave the house. And so they do. Thorolf's wife goes and asks for mercy. And the king said, if Thorolf surrenders and throws himself on my mercy, he shall lose neither life nor limb, but his men must be punished according to their deserts. Olver Hufna then went up to the house and had Thorolf called out to talk to him. He told him the terms the king was offering. Thorolf said, I am not accepting any terms forced on me by the king. Ask the king to allow us to come outside. We shall then let fate take its course. So Olver returns this message. The king said, set fire to the house. I am not going to fight them and lose my own men. I know that Thorolf would do us great damage if we fought him out here. He will be hard enough to defeat inside, even though he has fewer men than we have here. And so they there's a house burning. And we saw in Njal Saga that is sort of regarded as an act of cowardice, but it's also a very vile thing to do. That the characters, the people who were willing to burn people in their houses were, there was a deep sense of violation that exists there. That it was somehow, there's no noble violence, but there was somehow this less noble form of violence, that it was a weaker form of destruction, and that it was quite horrifying. And so Thorolf manages, they break away through, and he jumps out. Thorolf went out first, then Thorgils, Galandi, and then the rest, one after another. Fighting broke out at once, and for a time Thorolf and his men used the house to shield their backs. But as it blazed up, the fire threatened them, and many of them were killed. Thorolf ran forward, striking to left and right, and charged at the king's standard. Then Thorgils, Galandi was killed. Thorolf came right up to the shield wall and ran the standard bearer through with his sword. Then Thorolf said, "I took 3 paces too few." He was now pierced by spears and swords, but the king himself dealt him his death wound, and Thorolf fell at the king's feet. The king then called out to his men to stop the killing, and they did so. He told them to go back down to the ships. And so we really, in the first 22 chapters, have this story about the unification of Norway. We have Thorolf, who is ultimately going to be Egil's uncle, who he never meets. We have Thorolf as really this key character across this. We see his sort of rise and fall, and a rise and fall that occur at the behest. His rise is at the king's behest, and his fall is at the king's behest. And so we're seeing that this is the situation in Norway that Egil will be born into, ultimately. That is going to be a reason that Egil and his family, and Grim, now Skalagrim, since he's gone bald, poor guy, but remember, he's a good manager. Skalagrim has fallen in love. He's married, but he's bald. And eventually, he's going to decide that the land where his brother was murdered, the land where this type of king rules, isn't necessarily the type of land he wants to live in and raise his family in. And so we will meet Egil next week. But I hope you enjoyed this first section in Egil's Saga. I was, of course, reminded of many different works. Saga served as a great counterpoint, that difference between the danger of central authority and its unchecked power in a monarchy versus in Njal Saga, the danger of sort of anarchy, those perpetual blood feuds that are just cycling and there's no king to stop them, were interesting. I was reminded in a number of ways, the way that the saga writers can sometimes just take these sudden detours remind me a little bit of the Histories of Herodotus, where he just goes off on tangents because he thinks it's suddenly important. It's worth noting down, and a reason it's one of my favorite works. There was also a sense of the type of narrative structure that exists in First and Second Kings in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. I had thought Njal Saga reminded me to a certain degree of the society we saw in the book of Judges, where there's that refrain, and in those days Israel had no king, and sort of the violence that existed there. Here we have royal violence, but we have this sense of it's violence with this government authority behind it, and which is a different form. The sense of false counselors and sort of traitors, in the shadows remind me, of course, of A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. And the way that Egil Saga specifically is structured around giving this backstory of one generation and then letting that flow through multiple generations to ultimately this flowering of these main characters in a younger generation reminds me a great deal of The Rainbow by D.H. Lawrence. The Forge of Christendom by Tom Holland has a number of passages of contemporary events in Europe, including some narratives around the Vikings and Northern Europe, and could be worth the time for those who want to explore some nonfiction that's of much broader survey. So this was Egil Saga. Let me know your thoughts, and I will be sure to link the videos that all of my wonderful co-hosts put out this weekend. Elena Macardina, Lukash over at A Cruel Reader's Thesis, Elizabeth Bakken from the Bookish North, Mark Richardson from Richardson Reads, Dario, Scott Danielson, Tilly from Tilly's Shelf, and Roz were sharing in the fun. So I look forward to chapters 23 through 44 next weekend. Have a great one, everybody. Thanks.